Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from The Black Dog, Music for Airport Lounges. Alright, I guess this is round 5 of me doing a video on the Sheffield techno and ambient trio The Black Dog, Ken Downey, Martin Dust, Richard Dust. They've released lots of great albums over the years and kept at it, putting out quality work in this scene for decades. I'll have to do a discography review of them someday, but you can check the description for a bunch of old videos I've done on them before. Last video I did of them was for their album from the end of 2021, Music for Photographers, a rock-solid return to straight ambient music and creating some pretty effective moody blends that kept me invested for over an hour. And since then they've kept busy as usual, putting out various EPs along similar lines. But it is perhaps this recent string of ambient-leaning releases inspired by all the dilapidated architecture around the Sheffield area that may have also inspired them to return to the themes of a certain other old project of theirs that looms large over this era of their catalog. Back in 2010, they released Music for Real Airports, an album designed as a response to Brian Eno's classic Ambient 1 Music for Airports, where Eno originally stuck to a tranquil and minimalistic style that could lull airport customers into feeling more comfortable before traveling. That became his trademark and obviously set the scene for the entire ambient music landscape we know today. The Black Dog looked at that concept and decided to go about it from a much more literal angle, capture what it actually felt like to go through an airport and realistically portray the experience, which is typically not nearly as pleasant, directly contrasting Eno's comfortable ambient utopia with the dystopian reality. I thought that album was an absolutely brilliant idea and executed to its fullest potential, showing off lots of mildly anxious but downbeat ambient and techno compositions that perfectly fit the vibe they were going for. It's one of the absolute best in their catalog. I'd say it's my third favorite of their albums, behind Silenced and Spanners, and I've probably come back to it a fair bit more than I have the Eno album, since I feel it's a much more engaging and multi-dimensional listen. Serves a different kind of purpose, but still. And obviously this t-shirt here spun off that album that I'm sure regular viewers of this channel will be able to recognize from my wearing over lots of different videos in the past year and a quarter. And this is probably the favorite t-shirt I own, because it's like the most niche reference of any of my t-shirts. If I go to like a family gathering wearing it and like some aunt or uncle asks me what it means, I have to both explain who the Black Dog is and who Brian Eno is, which is... That's always fun. And obviously all of this is directly relevant to mention, not only because of the recent repress they did of the album and the new run of related t-shirts they kicked off this past January. If you want a t-shirt like mine, check their website. But they've also obviously been directly revisiting the concept of Music for Real Airports in their newest releases. First, they put out an EP called Music for Dead Airports, about the empty airports in Sheffield that had to close down. That was pretty cool. And now they've made this album here, Music for Airport Lounges, a full-length companion to what they did in 2010, aided by over 200 hours of field recordings of airports they'd recorded and just had laying around in their archives. Now, this project is not merely just Music for Real Airports again. As you may tell from the title, it's a slightly different concept that aims to specifically capture the lounge in an airport and the experience of waiting to get on your flight. Arguably the area in the airport where you encounter the most frustration, either from the area itself being overcrowded and uncomfortable for everyone, maybe smelling weird, having limited amenities, the possible unpleasantness of the attendants who have to sit and work there, and of anyone who might end up on the same flight as you, and obviously all manner of noisiness around you which make it very difficult to relax. Now, the much narrower focus of this album does lead to a listening experience which is markedly less varied, and it may not surprise you to hear that as a result I don't think this album is equally enjoyable to listen. But it does just as good a job at capturing the specific vibe it's going for, giving you another seamless collection of ambient pieces which are even lower key, but further heighten the most anxious vibes of that project. It's much more in line with what they did on Music for Photographers, but maybe even more subtly disquieting than that project was. I will say the biggest highlight on the album for me right off the bat is the opener, Gate 21, an absolutely stunning mix of escalating dramatic synth pads that keep building and sounding more and more expansive as they go along. It's very large and imposing sounding, and may show a little bit of their influences from like 80s darkwave styles, but also feels oddly comforting in its particular melodic construction as well. And that's the best track, though that's obviously not to say the rest of the album doesn't have lots of nice ideas throughout as well. The comparatively more welcoming mood of the opener is fairly immediately broken up with the much more actively foreboding tones of the two-parter BCN4. The first part focuses on some extremely subtle techno rhythms being filtered as if they're barely even present, but mostly being drowned out by these growling pads that sound like there's some heavy machinery being operated in another room. And the second part sounds almost like a completely different track altogether, hitting you with a lot of formless experimental effects and some even more foreboding and sinister pads. It gets pretty dang intense. And pretty cool. But that bleeds into some comparatively peaceful moments, like Meal Deal T, which has all these mildly alien-sounding one-note melodic drones, leading into Pass Out Control, which has some sleepier but more dramatic chord progressions and some slightly edgier and noisier Tim Hecker-y moments. And then things start to get more experimental again. Late Night Cabin Fever Crying Baby Mix has lots of intense drones that get sent through mildly wobbling filters to really further the most disorienting sensations. And you start to hear field recordings of the planes themselves and their barely audible pilots being introduced as well. EMA Long Stay blends in some particularly harsh drones which sound like you're right by the plane engines themselves, and then you're finally given a brief moment to breathe in 1000 Year Chair, which has all these liquid pads that vaguely resemble choirs or something, and field recordings in the background of people like pulling their suitcases behind them, bouncing over cracks in the floor. Rapid Pickup takes you into more mildly harsher drones that may filter and melt through recordings of, I guess, maybe the area where cars come by to pick up and drop people off, and feature some chillingly distorted whistling pads on the side. And then we get into Sleep Deprivation 3, the track that most directly ties into ideas from the original Music for Real Airports. You hear the beeping noises in the background that played throughout Sleep Deprivation 1 and 2 from that album, a little bit of the subtle techno kicks from the former of those, and a little bit of the ambient drones from the latter. But you might not even pick up on the connections if you don't, play them next to each other for comparison. This is a track that's mainly being characterized by a lot more, intense buzzing drones that, overtake everything and create one of the most openly foreboding and unpleasant moments on display here. Though, enjoyably unpleasant, if that makes sense. Pretty neat callbacks and recontextualizing the old ideas here. But that leads into another one of my favorite tracks here, Leeds and Bradford. This was one of the tracks that most consistently stood out to me every time I put the album on. The plunking synth chords playing throughout this one are among the most striking textures of a track here, and the field recording drones in the background are more dynamic too. You can start to hear a plane getting ready to get on the runway, revving up its engine, slowing back down again, and then finally speeding up again, and then getting ready to take off. I can almost feel the sensation of being on the plane while this one is on sometimes. And then the album finally winds down. We get one more neutral drone piece, an Act of Dog, that has some bass rumbling in the background and maybe a little beeping from a metal detector. And then finally the album finishes with Longest Journey Home, which I think reprises some of the melodic pad progressions from Pass Out Control, or maybe presents them in a bit of a clearer fashion, kind of more forming a bit of a slow, broken three-note minor chord instead of the more formless cloud they form on the track they take from. Eventually bringing back in some bass to further up the some more dramatic effect, and finally fading out as a bit of a slow, relieved exhale that we're finally out of the woods. And there we have everything on Music for Airport Lounges. It's really freaking solid, as to be expected out of these guys. The listening experience is as front-to-back engaging as I would hope, and perfectly nails that anxious mood. Again, it's even more anxious and foreboding a listen than the album it's aiming to follow up. Again, I wouldn't say it's as strong as that album, since that one, again, felt like it had more variety in terms of the musical ideas on display, while this one went for a much subtler approach. But I still think it's a worthy companion to that album all the same. I enjoyed it about equally as much as I enjoyed Music for Photographers, and this is probably more seamless a listen than that already fairly seamless project. There have definitely been listens when I would miss, like, when half the tracks started because they transitioned so cleanly. If you haven't heard the original music for Real Airports, I'd recommend hearing that one first, but this one is definitely worth hearing as well, and effectively adds on to what that album started without stepping on its toes or even failing to stand alone as its own separate thing. So yeah, I've enjoyed this quite a bit as I've been sitting with it over the past 2 weeks or so, and I can give it a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.